Most crimes are run-of-the-mill and prosaic affairs except for the direct participants, whether victims or perpetrators, to outside observers. There is usually little to separate one gas station robbery from another, or make one street mugging stand out from others. However, every now and then, we get a crime or criminal so bonkers that people cannot help but perk up and pay attention. Following are 20 fascinating things about some of history's most bonkers crimes and criminals. Number 20. The One-Legged Gangsters. Around the turn of 20th century, Melbourne, Australia, was terrorized by a band of toughs known as the Crutchy Push. Push was Australian slang for gang, and the crutchy part came from the gang, being composed almost exclusively of one-legged men who used crutches. The sole exception was a member who had both legs, but was missing an arm. He stuffed the empty sleeve with a brick to swing it around like a flail during fights. Led by one Valentine Keating, who had lost his right leg, the Crutchy Push's membership criterion boiled down to a missing limb, a thirst for drink, and a fighting attitude. Surprisingly, they were well-nigh unbeatable. They practiced and perfected a fighting technique in which they jabbed victims in the midriff with a crutch tip, causing them to double over, then used the metal-shod armrest like a club to bash them in the head. Number 19. Like a flying kangaroo. The Crutchy Push's crutch foo enabled them to rule the streets of Melbourne from 1895 to 1905. They earned their way with strong-armed robberies and extortions, demanding drink, food, and money from pubs, shops, and members of the public. They viciously defended their turf against rival gangs, and encroached on the turf of others with impunity. The Crutchy's Push took on all comers, including the cops. In 1898, the One-Legged Gangsters were involved in a sprawling brawl, and when the police arrived to quell the disturbance, the Crutchies turned on them as well. Their leader, Valentine Keating, knocked down a constable, but when his colleagues tried to arrest, they were astonished at just how fast a one-legged man could move. As one of them testified in court about his failure to catch Keating, he was off like a flying kangaroo, although he goes on crutches. Number 18. The Terrible 10, Australia's toughest cops. The Crutchy Push and other gangs grew so out of control that the authorities set up a special police task force to deal with them, known as the Terrible 10. It recruited Australia's biggest and most violent cops, equipped them with heavy rubber hoses, and sent them to whale the stuffing out of the street toughs. The Terrible 10 won the streets back by beating most gangs into submission. The exception were the Crutchies, who remained unsubdued until Valentine Keating, their leader, his girlfriend, and his chief lieutenant, were imprisoned for a murderous assault on a constable. Their victim was beaten so bad, he was still picking pieces of skull from his fractured head at the time of the trial. Upon his release from prison, Keating opened an unlicensed bar. With his crutch ever by his side, he never needed to call the police to settle a disturbance in his establishment. Number 17. The Hillbilly Mafia War that featured homemade tanks and aerial bombings. In 1913, Charlie Beerier, born Skapna Yitzhak Beerier to a Jewish family in Russia, settled in a coal mining region in rural southern Illinois. It was a dry part of the state, but local rules did not eliminate drinkers' thirst. So Beerier forged an alliance between hill people who manufactured booze in illicit stills and the miners who drank it, and set up shop as a small-time bootlegger and pimp. When Prohibition arrived in 1920, Beerier graduated from a two-bit to a major bootlegger, with a network that stretched from Florida to the Canadian border. A ruthless operator, he crushed the local Ku Klux Klan not out of ignoble motives, but because they impeded his bootlegging operations. Whatever his motives, crushing the Ku Klux Klan made Beerier a local hero until things went haywire when he fell out with his business partners. The ensuing conflict was fought with homemade tanks and aerial bombings. Number 16. The first aerial bombing on American soil. In 1925, Charlie Beerier partnered up with another bootlegger gang run by Carl Shelton and his brothers to jointly transport imported booze from Florida to Chicago. The partnership quickly fell apart, however, because of cheating in the collection of the proceeds and divvying up of the profits. Things escalated quickly. In one incident in 1926, Beerier's gang was attacked by a Shelton homemade tank, a 2.5-ton truck covered in steel armor, with a turret from which numerous firearms protruded. A month later, the Sheltons upped the ante and escalated things some more, when they hired an airplane to drop sticks of dynamite over a Beerier hideout. Nobody was hurt, but it made history as the first known aerial bombing in the U.S. Beerier fought back in a more traditional way, with assassinations and ambuscades. Number 15. Crossing the line. The Southern Illinois bootlegger war lasted 6 months, during which dozens of bodies were left across the region in culverts, floating in streams, or sitting in bullet-riddled cars along the road. Berrier was remarkably open about his criminality, broadcasting messages over local radio to assure the public that they were safe, because only gangsters were getting killed. He also publicly boasted of his intent to kill a Shelton ally. The mayor of a small town then had him murdered. He was arrested but might have walked if his gangsters had not also abducted and murdered a state trooper and his wife. The state trooper was dirty, but his wife, a popular schoolteacher, was seen as innocent, and that finally turned public opinion against Berrier. He was tried, convicted, and on April 19, 1928, was hanged before a crowd of 5,000. Illinois' last public hanging. Number 14. The Wig Stealing Bandits. Nowadays, wigs are so cheap that you can get a reasonably realistic-looking one at Walmart for under $10. There was a time, however, when wigs were necessities for the upper crust, and quite expensive necessities at that. In the 18th century, for example, making a decent wig usually could take 6 men working 6 days from sunup to sundown. As a result, a good wig could cost as much as an average workman earned in a year. Such a small fortune propped atop rich people's heads made wigs an attractive target for highwaymen, strong-arm robbers, or simple snatch-and-run street urchins. Number 13. Targeting bigwigs. Highwaymen in particular targeted aristocrats, who were spotted wearing elaborate wigs. Since only the rich could afford big wigs, rich nobles were nicknamed bigwigs, after the lucrative target atop their heads. Not all wig thieves used force. One account tells of a wig bandit so bold and skilled that he was able to replace his target's expensive wig with a cheap rug when the mark was distracted. The aristo, unaware of the switch, would then walk away, unaware that he had just lost a fortune. Unfortunately for the thieves, their gravy train eventually came to a halt when wigs went out of fashion. Number 12. Smuggling heroin inside the corpses of dead GIs. Frank Lucas, whose criminal career was featured in the 2007 blockbuster American Gangster, is perhaps the most famous African-American criminal born and raised in North Carolina. Lucas claimed he was traumatized into a life of crime after witnessing his 12-year-old cousin get his brains blown out by the Ku Klux Klan for his reckless eyeballing of a white woman. While the movie took artistic license with Lucas' life and career, it got the broad strokes right. He really was a big wheel in the heroin trade, and was one of America's biggest drug dealers in the 1960s and 1970s. During the Vietnam War, he smuggled heroin into the U.S. inside the bodies of dead American soldiers, or at least inside their coffins. Number 11. Making it in the Big Apple. After a few years of petty crimes, such as mugging drunks outside bars, Frank Lucas got a job at a pipe company when he was 16. His employment ended when his boss walked in on his daughter and Lucas having sex. In the ensuing fight, the budding hoodlum knocked out the outraged father with a pipe blow to the head. Then, figuring in for a penny, in for a pound, he stole $400 from the company till and fled to New York City. There, Lucas met and became the protege of Bumpy Johnson, Harlem's crime boss. However, Lucas was given to stretching the truth, or outright fibbing. So the details of his early life, which are based on his own accounts, should be taken with a grain of salt. When Bumpy Johnson died in 1968, they left Harlem up for grabs and Lucas grabbed as much turf as he could. Number 10. The Ghoulish smuggling scheme. After Frank Lucas got established in Harlem, he took to traveling. He eventually ended up in Thailand, where he ran into a U.S. Army sergeant who turned out to be a distant cousin, and who put Lucas in touch with local heroin dealers. The cousins worked out a plan to import heroin from its source in Southeast Asia, bypassing the Italian mafia, which had a near-total heroin monopoly at the time. The savings were huge. Buying heroin at source cost Lucas $4,200 a kilo. Buying the same kilo in Harlem from the mafia would have cost him $50,000. The main difficulty was getting the drugs into the U.S. The cousins solved it by smuggling heroin inside the coffins of American servicemen killed in the Vietnam War. Lucas claimed that heroin bricks were stuffed inside the cadavers of the fallen. His cousin disputed that, however, and contended that the drugs were smuggled in relatively less ghoulish fashion, in the coffins but not inside the corpses. Number 9. The heroin kingpin. However he smuggled it, Frank Lucas smuggled plenty of heroin into the U.S. He claimed that he made $1 million a day at the height of his career. It was an exaggeration. But he did make a lot of money from heroin. He used the drug profits to buy real estate all over the country, including ranches in which he raised and bred Black Angus cattle, apartments in Miami and LA, and office buildings in Detroit. His career ended in 1975, when his New Jersey home was raided by a joint DEA and NYPD task force, and authorities found $584,000 in cash. He was tried on federal and state drug charges, convicted and sentenced in 1976 to 70 years in prison. Lucas got out by turning state's evidence and testifying against his former colleagues. Number 8. Walking the straightish and narrow-ish. After he ratted out his former colleagues, Frank Lucas and his family were placed in the Witness Protection Program in 1977. Between his testimony and evidence he gave the authorities, over 100 drug-related convictions were secured. He was rewarded for his cooperation in 1981 with a sentence reduction to time served plus lifetime parole, and he walked out of prison a free man. Lucas was back behind bars in 1984 after he was caught and convicted of trying to swap some heroin and cash for a kilo of cocaine. He was sentenced to 7 years and released in 1991. He walked the straight and narrow, or at least was not convicted of anything major from then until his death in 2019. Number 7. History's worst nun. Mariana de Leyva y Marino was born to a wealthy banking family in Milan. Her mother died during Mariana's infancy, so her father dumped her on an aunt to raise her, and forgot about her as he pursued his business affairs across Europe. At age 13, her dad remembered her long enough to force her into a convent in Monza. Somewhere along the line during those years of childhood neglect, something went wrong and Mariana went off the edge. By the time the dust had settled, she had shacked up with a criminal lover, had multiple illegitimate children, and went on a crime spree that featured murder and blackmail. And just for flavor and to add to the crazy, Mariana took a stab at eating human shit. Number 6. The Nun and Her Lover. After getting dumped into a convent, things went well for Mariana, at least for a while. She took the name Sister Virginia and became a role model for younger novices. In her 20s, however, she fell head over heels in love, or lust, with a young aristocratic womanizer named Giovanni Paolo Osio. A years-long torrid affair ensued. Osio commissioned a copy of the convent's keys, and with the complicity of other nuns and a friendly priest, routinely snuck into Mariana's room. She birthed 2 children, one a stillborn, the other a daughter who was adopted by Osio. Mariana alternated between gratifying her lust and guilt-tripping over her sins. At some point, hoping to turn her irresistible lust for Osio into disgust, she began eating his feces. It did not work. Then in 1606, a nun threatened to expose the affair, so Osio and Mariana murdered her, and threatened the other nuns with the same if they tattled. Number 5. Getting bricked up into a cell. Mariana and her lover tried covering their tracks by spreading a story that the murdered nun had ran off, but rumors soon spread of iffy goings-on at the Monza convent, so Osio started murdering more people to quell the rumors, including the man he had commissioned to make copies of the convent's keys, and an apothecary who had supplied Mariana with abortion herbs. It didn't work, and eventually word reached the governor of Milan, who ordered an investigation. Osio, Mariana, and their complicit enablers were arrested in 1607, and tortured to reveal what they knew. Osio escaped and was sentenced to death in absentia. He was killed soon thereafter by an acquaintance. Mariana was sentenced to life in solitary confinement, bricked up in a small cell measuring 4 feet by 9. She stayed there for 14 years until she was deemed reformed and released, to spend her remaining days in a convent. Number 4. A hard-to-murder charlatan. Illiterate Siberian peasant, mystic, and charlatan faith healer Rasputin, Russian for the debauched one, had a reputation for licentiousness since his teens. At 18 he studied at a monastery and joined a flagellant sect, but perverted its beliefs by inventing a doctrine that nearness to God is best achieved by holy passionlessness. The best way to get there, according to Rasputin, was with sexual exhaustion after prolonged bouts of debauchery by the entire congregation that would get all the base passions out of their system and allow them to focus on God without distractions. He also had an inexplicable ability to soothe the suffering of the Russian emperor's young son and heir, who suffered from hemophilia. It won Rasputin imperial favor, which made him an incongruously powerful and influential figure in the Russian Empire's final years, that made him enemies who decided to murder Rasputin, only to discover that they had their work cut out for them. Number 3. From wandering monk to imperial whisperer. Rasputin began his career as a wandering monk, living off donations and gradually building up a reputation as a holy man who could predict the future and heal the sick. He ended up in St. Petersburg in 1903, at a time when mysticism was fashionable with its decadent court and high society. Rasputin, the dirty, smelly, holy peasant with brilliant and captivating eyes and a reputation for faith healing, was a hit. He exerted a powerful animal magnetism upon high society women, and soon had a cult following of wealthy aristocrats throwing themselves at him like groupies at a rock star. One of them introduced him to Empress Alexandria, whose son suffered from hemophilia. Rasputin was able to soothe the child's suffering, which earned him the mother's fierce loyalty. Soon the royal airhead was convinced that Rasputin was guided by God. She started soliciting the illiterate charlatan's advice on matters of state, then badgered her weak-minded husband, the emperor, into implementing Rasputin's recommendations. Number 2. Running the Russian Empire. Before long, ministers and high officials were being appointed and dismissed based on Rasputin's advice. Those seeking to advance or secure their positions offered him lavish bribes, or sent their wives and daughters to seduce him into putting in a good word for them with the emperor and empress. That scandalous state of affairs made the imperial government a laughingstock and brought it into low repute, but the empress remained fiercely protective of Rasputin. So a group of aristocrats, led by a Prince Felix Yusupov, husband of the emperor's niece, decided to rid Russia of Rasputin's malign influence by murdering him. Rasputin was lured to Yusupov's palace on the night of December 30, 1916, on the pretext of meeting Yusupov's wife, who was interested in knowing him. Many nobles had offered their womenfolk to Rasputin before, so the invitation was not unusual. His murder turned out to be as weird as his life had been. Number 1. History's hardest murder. At Yusupov's palace, while waiting for his host's wife to freshen up, Rasputin was offered cakes and tea laced with cyanide. He ate and drank with no ill effects. He was then offered poisoned wine. He quaffed it without a problem, asked for another glass, then one more after that. Exasperated, Yusupov retrieved a pistol and shot Rasputin in the chest. Believing him dead, the conspirators went about covering their tracks. Then Rasputin rose hours later and attacked Yusupov. The prince managed to free himself and fled up the stairs. Rasputin left via the palace courtyard, where the panicked conspirators caught up with and shot him again. They then wrapped his body in a rug, cut a hole in a frozen river's surface, and shoved him in. When his body was eventually recovered, it was reported that it had not been the bullets or poison that had killed him, but drowning. He was presumably still alive when thrown into the river.